So, what can be done about that? It's not at all clear to me what a policy fix would be that wouldn't involve turning people away when they're apprehended at the border.
I do think that there is a fix within the current framework that is doable just with money. And it will require money from Congress for sure. That's the thing. This is impossible to do with presidential action. I think people are deluding themselves if they think Trump on the day number one, everything's going to change. Some things are going to change because he has this scaremongering effect on illegal immigrants that there's going to be fewer people coming at first. But the source of the issue is not going to change. So imagine you had a huge influx of more high-skilled immigrants. Instead of low skill, we get high skill. Who's going to be negatively affected? The physician is not going to compete with the cook in the restaurant, right? So the restaurant wages and the low skill wages are going to be unaffected. If anything, there is more demand for their services. They're actually going to go up their wages. That's going to have the secondary effects, right? And in the high school sector, you could say, well, we're going to get lower wages for college professors, as if that wasn't already the case, right? Like most college professors are foreign anyway, and doctors and all of that. Well, this is why actually high skilled immigration reduces income inequality.
Hello, Daniel. How are you?
Hey, Glenn, good. All great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Doing well. Thank you. This is Glenn Loury. If you're looking at this, you've tuned into the Glenn Show. I'm a professor at Brown University and John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And this week, I'm talking with Daniel Martino, who is a graduate fellow at the Manhattan Institute. We're colleagues, and a doctoral student, PhD student in economics at Columbia University, writes about immigration. And that's why I asked Daniel on the program so we could talk about what he knows, mine his wisdom on the immigration question, and get the benefit of him dealing with the data and whatnot, estimating the impact on fiscal stability of American government of immigration flows, and arguing passionately for the importance of targeting immigration toward high-skilled people who bring a lot of value added when they come, and so forth and so on. But anyway, Daniel, thanks for doing the program.
Thanks for having me. Very excited. On first time we talked too.
Yeah, it's good to meet you. So, where are you from?
Yeah, I'm from Venezuela. Um, in South America, as you probably know from the news, a lot of things going on in my native country.
So you are an immigrant yourself. Do you intend to make your life here in the United States?
Yeah. And let me tell you a little bit about that story. So I came in 2016 to the US. Venezuela was already in a terrible, of course, mess. I was born the same year that the current socialist regime took over in 1999. I'm 25 years old. And well, I saw how my life and everything around me was being destroyed with inflation, with shortages, crime. Then more people started leaving, no teachers in the schools, blackouts, no water. Now that people are talking about pets and whatever, and immigrants, like the animals in the zoo being eaten because there's no food in Venezuela, everything you can imagine happened. And so it's very sad because Venezuela used to be a rich and free and prosperous country. It's a country that welcomed my grandparents, who were also immigrants in Venezuela in the 50s. And it's a country that welcomed millions of people all throughout its history. And so I came to America. I got a Fulbright scholarship in 2016 to go to Indiana. I graduated from Indiana, worked in Kentucky, and getting my PhD at Columbia in New York City.
That's Indiana University in Bloomington?
No, in Indianapolis. I went to Indianapolis campus.
Uh-huh.
The
What
little
happened?
sister, the more serious campus. Bloomington is the party campus.
So what happened in Venezuela? What went wrong?
Well, what went wrong was that for the first time, I would say in history, country democratically elects a socialist tyranny into power. And because think about it, right? Like when you think about all the other socialist nations throughout history, none of them were democratically elected. But Venezuela was. In 1998, December, Hugo Chavez won the election with a very large majority of the vote because people were tired of the establishment, of corruption, we were there were some problems economically in the late 90s that people were mad about, rightfully. The problem was that Chavez was not the solution. Chavez began nationalizing land. He rewrote the constitution. Um, he began imposing price controls on everything, forbidding foreign exchange currency from being purchased inside the country. So capital controls. He began, just destroying the whole private sector with regulations and taxes and takeovers. Eventually, what happened was that obviously private investment plummeted. He began spending massive amounts of money. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the planet, by the way. So if a country should be rich, it's Venezuela. I joke to people and I tell them that I shouldn't be here in the US talking to anyone. I should be in a Lamborghini in Caracas in an alternative history timeline, like all the Emiratis in Dubai, right? Where 90% of the population is like they're foreign workers that work for them, and then they have all these great cars and jets, because that's what happens when you have oil and private property, right? You become incredibly wealthy. But Venezuela wasted all of that in free food, free gasoline, free water, free electricity, free housing. And even that money from oil was not enough to pay for all of that. So the government printed money and led to hyperinflation that destroyed our purchasing power. I became extremely poor from being middle class.
Why was Chavez so popular? You say he voted in.
Yes.
Were the people justified in the resentment that they might have had toward wealthy and corporations? Were there legitimate concerns about Venezuelan wealth being somehow expropriated by and not redounding to the benefit of the people that Chavez represented? How could he have? Yeah.
Mhm. I would say Venezuela's problem was that it was stagnant since the 90s. If you see the GDP per capita of Venezuela, there's basically no growth from the mid 90s from the mid 70s to the mid 90s, 20 years. And the main reason I would argue is because in 1976 is when the oil sector was completely nationalized. And even in the democratic period, the politicians began just using the oil money to redistribute. And in order to do it and not cause hyperinflation, they just reduced capital investments in the oil company. So oil production began gradually falling since the 70s. And so, they could redistribute, and it was great in the beginning, in the first few years. But as oil production fell, and the government became subject to the whims of the oil markets internationally, because that's where the revenue came from, then it created a lot of volatility. It created a lot of gradual decline in the country. And Chavez was a guy who came promising that, blame those problems on the politicians, which, it was their fault. His problem was the solution, right? The solution was not more socialism, it was free markets. And he just doubled down on the socialism. Yeah. And people were resentful. He sowed a lot of that resentment against the rich. It was really a class thing for him. And it's a shame, right? Because now what people say in Venezuela, it's a really harrowing quote, but it's commonplace, is that we were rich, but we didn't know it.
Do you go back?
No. And in fact, today I would probably be tortured if I went back just for what I've done on TV and media against the government. In fact, I have a friend who is in jail right now, and she has been there for over a month.
Wow. Let's talk about the U.S. Do we have a crisis at the southern border?
I would argue, I would say yes. When there any definition, I would say yes.
Why? Whose fault is it, in your opinion?
Well, I would say it is a problem that every year there are millions of people coming in unvetted and illegally through the southern border. Number one, it's a security issue, right? Many of these people have ended up committing crimes. Legal immigrants and immigrants in general commit far less crime than native-born Americans, even than native-born whites, by the way. Immigrants on average commit less crime than native-born whites. Yet the problem is, if you can stop criminal immigrants from coming, why wouldn't you want to? I'm talking about gang members, people that are known to be dangerous. You would want to stop them all. And the problem is that that's not what's happening. They're just basically letting them in, sealing them, giving them a notice to appear in court, and then they're being released. And I think that is both the fault of the current the current presidential administration, but it's also really part of global trends. And I think that's underestimated on the right. The labor market in the US has been booming with job openings. And there's a very high correlation between job openings in the US and illegal immigration. And then the other issue comes from who is coming. Before, say 20 years ago, 90% of people crossing the border were Mexican. Today, maybe two-thirds are not Mexican. And it's very easy to send back a Mexican because you just send them right across the border to their own country of citizenship. There's no questions asked. But you cannot send to Mexico people from who are not Mexican. Mexico is a sovereign country too. And once they're in US territory, that's not Mexico's problem. And Mexico doesn't want them with good reason. And so what happens now is that you can't deport somebody from Venezuela, let's say. You can't deport somebody from Haiti. You can't deport you can deport people even from China. China is not accepting deported citizens. Because why would they? Right? They use this as a foreign policy tool to extract concessions from the United States. And so immigration has become a foreign policy issue too.
Just on the deportation question, candidate and former President Trump promises to deport illegal immigrants. On what you've just said, it's not clear that that's a feasible thing to do.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. I think the whole thing about mass deportations is a great campaign slogan, but that's not going to happen. I think optimistically, Trump will be able to deport 1 million people in 4 years. And it won't be the 1 million people that people really want to deport. It will be the really terrible stories that are going to cause family separation and crying and political backlash. Because what people don't understand is that nobody who has a pending immigration court date can be deported until their case is resolved through immigration courts. And the people who have pending dates are the recent illegal immigrants who came under Biden. So if Trump deports somebody, it will be the people who came 20 years ago, who have children here, and are going to have all these sad stories on the media and by the Democrats.
So if people can somehow get themselves physically on this side of the border and establish a identity and a presence within the judicial framework, that is, I assume they're going for asylum and their case has to be adjudicated, they have a right to stay until their case is adjudicated, which could be years. So de facto, they could disappear into the population and make their lives here in the United States.
That's right. And because the asylum hearing time is taking over 5 years on average, by then, many of those people already have American kids too. And then they appeal. And then there's something else that happens. And so it's very, very difficult to deal with it now.
But that makes me think that the core of the issue is the principle that people who can present themselves have a kind of standing or a right to make a claim, and it would be a humanitarian disaster to deny them. So there's a kind of moral commitment to a kind of openness that is at work there.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that that's what the law says, because then the United States passed the 1980 Refugee Act that defines what a refugee is and it's the right to claim asylum. And if you wanted to modify that, you would need to pass the filibuster. So that's not changing anytime soon unless you give something in exchange to the Democrats. And that's going to require, obviously, mass amnesty.
So what can be done about that? It's not at all clear to me what a policy fix would be that wouldn't involve turning people away when they're apprehended at the border.
I do think that there is a fix within the current framework that is doable just with money. And it will require money from Congress for sure. That's the thing. This is impossible to do with presidential action. I think people are deluding themselves if they think Trump on the day number one, everything's going to change. Some things are going to change because he has this scaremongering effect on illegal immigrants that there's going to be fewer people coming at first. But the source of the issue is not going to change. For that, you will need to say, what is the incentive to present yourself and make a false asylum claim? Is that you're going to be allowed in, right? And are going to work and are going to live here for several years. We basically have a free work visa as you show up at the border. That's what we have. And so if you want to change that, you will need to detain people while their case is being heard. Now, you can't detain people for 5 years. That would be inhumane and impossible too, because of the numbers. So you will need to accelerate the asylum processing to just weeks or perhaps a couple months. Now, that requires money because the number of immigration judges that decides these cases nationwide is about 700 for over 4 million pending cases. So we're talking about you probably need, well over an extra 1,000 new immigration judges. This is going to take time. You probably will need to do some sort of reordering of the cases, leave current cases to the end, perhaps even do some sort of temporary amnesty for the people that are already here and then fix it for the people coming forward.
I see. What fraction of the cases which do get eventually adjudicated are rejected? What fraction are granted asylum? Do you know?
Yeah, so it depends on the type, but of the people who come through the border who do defensive asylum claims, it's less. It's definitely less than half, but it's about a quarter. It really fluctuates by year. It's actually really interesting. When Trump was in office, like 10% approval, and now with Biden is like 30-40% approval. Um,
Wow.
but so this is something people don't know, that the immigration court system is not Article 3. They're not real judges. They are political appointees by the president, by the executive branch, by the Department of Justice.
To terms of a fixed period?
I am not actually sure. I believe that it's like a regular judge where it's until you quit.
So the Trump judges were more strict?
Much more strict. And some judges, by the way, are obviously like illegally strict. There's a couple judges that have never approved an asylum case in their whole career.
Wow.
And it's obvious that there's something going on behind this. And if you see their history, like they work for like anti-immigration groups, and then the Democrats appoint like immigrant rights group activists as immigration judges themselves too. And so the immigration court system is really totally messed up.
What happens to those whose cases are rejected or declined?
So they get put on deportation proceedings. The problem is, imagine you are from one country that does not take deported citizens. You will be in a perpetual deportation order until somebody agrees to take you back. And until then, you're allowed to stay here. What else are they going to do? And by the way, this has become a big issue with, say, the Afghans who came here because Biden brought them under the withdrawal, right?
Yeah.
Congress has been trying to pass what's called the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would legalize all the Afghans who came. And because Congress has not passed it, all those Afghans are on the asylum system, delaying further the cases from the border, by the way. And we're talking about maybe 100,000 Afghans. So they're delaying the cases from the border. They're here. If they get rejected, they can't be deported to Afghanistan. Who's going to deport them to Afghanistan? On what planes and what flights? It's controlled by the Taliban. You might as well just give them amnesty and approve them. You don't want to keep them under the shadows and delaying everything else. But Congress doesn't get anything done, so we stay with the status quo.
So it is said that the Biden administration issued on day one changes in immigration policy that are responsible in part for the crisis at the border. Do you think that's correct? What did they change? What's the difference between, as a practical matter, the border control policies of the previous administration, Trump, and that of the current administration?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this that are part of the political game. But what Biden did do on those first days was change the perception about the border. And that was a problem, right? He created the perception that people would be welcome. And that triggered more people to come. Just the perception actually affects this. When Trump was elected, the number of people crossing the southern border went down as soon as he was sworn in. And it wasn't because of any policy change that was effective on day number one. And so I think it was the perception. He did try to do some damaging things like suspend all deportations. That worked for like a few days, and then the court said it was illegal. And so he never really changed anything effectively. The people from the Trump campaign argue that Trump secured the border with the Remain in Mexico policy. Remain in Mexico is the same concept I explained to you of we need to detain people, but they wanted Mexico to detain them for the US. Now, that worked for a little bit, but then Mexico pulled out even before Biden came into office. Because why would Mexico detain hundreds of thousands of people on behalf of the United States? That's not Mexico's problem. Now, you could say, well, Trump could threaten them with tariffs or something. Sure, maybe some negotiation tactic could get Mexico to give us the free lunch, right? But I'm skeptical that at this flow that's coming across the border of over 2 million people a year, Mexico is going to detain 2 million people a year on their side of the border. That's an insane number to detain just on the border.
Okay, you're a quantitative economist in the making. So causality is something that you're interested in, causal inference. How do we know, as a matter of causal inference, that this deterrent, attraction rejection theory is correct? The idea that I assume the way the model would work is people are prospective immigrants, migrants, making a decision about whether or not to undertake the substantial cost of reaching and crossing the U.S. border, and are forward-looking and anticipating what the consequences that the net benefit to them will be. Of course, detention for 5 years or anything like that is a negative, not a positive. The chances of actually succeeding in their ambition to relocate to the United States, could be 0.7, it could be 0.3. The jawboning of a Donald Trump or a Joseph Biden materially affects people's estimate of that probability, and they decide to come or not come based upon that calculation. I could see reasons for doubting that. I could see, people are desperate. They come, they come regardless, or they have contacts, they have word of mouth. They come because they know someone else who came. But the green eye shade calculation, the probability of success is only 0.3. It's not worth it for me, How do you know? How do you know that that's
Yeah.
really what's going on?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. So it's word of mouth, right? And word of mouth, fake news and real news travel really fast, both. And when you get the news that Trump is going to come, I can assure you things do change just because of the tone. In fact, even regardless of political candidates, when Biden repealed Title 42, which was this pandemic policy that meant you were automatically rejected. Your case wasn't even heard because everybody assumed you had COVID. That obviously wasn't sustainable. That was a health policy. You would need to assume people have COVID. We know that's not a crisis anymore. And even with Title 42, it had a lot of other issues if you're ever interested in talking about it. But that sudden change in immigration policy led to a spike in border crossings right before it because they announced it's going to happen, September 30th. The week before September 30th, they announced it like a week before. That week, suddenly a ton of people who were waiting in Mexico started crossing before the policy change. Because that's the thing. There's a lot of people waiting in Mexico who live there for a couple months waiting to get to the U.S. They're working and they're just standing by ready to cross the border illegally from other countries. They live in camps in Mexico City, across the border, and in other parts. And right after the change in the policy for Title 42, it suddenly dropped. There's a huge shock effect that happens. It's temporary. I'm not saying it's a permanent shock, but it is a temporary shock. And the news does travel. I can tell you from people that I've spoken to that cross the border, that are living in New York City, that I've spoken at the shelters, and they're heavily misinformed. I'll tell you, they don't know anything about the law or the legal process with immigration. Many of them assume they will eventually get legal automatically. That there's a process to do that. That they don't even need to apply for asylum. And so they believe fake news, really.
Okay. Now, I looked at some of your stuff. I know that you are involved in trying to calculate what the burdens are associated with people in terms of drawing on public resources, and also in terms of contributions that people are making who come and so on. You want to talk a little bit about that? You have a project that issued a report at the Manhattan Institute on targeting immigration toward more highly skilled people. You admire the policies in Canada, Australia, and whatnot that give a premium in their immigration policies to bringing in people who have college degrees and who have skills. You're worried about there not being enough doctors around and so on. You
Yeah,
think HB1 visas ought to be expanded? We're not getting enough engineers coders from India, and so
no,
talk about
not
that.
enough.
Talk about that.
Not enough. I know that's funny because people feel like there's a lot, but really it's really very very few the flow of highly skilled immigrants as a share of the population and as a share of all immigrants coming too. And so let me give you an example that really shocks people when I tell them. If you're a Nobel Prize winner who happened to have been born in India, you are not allowed to get an employment-based green card in the United States. A Nobel Prize winner. There is a category called extraordinary ability that if you win the Nobel or an Olympic medal or have other extraordinary accomplishments, you are automatically qualified for that green card. But there's a cap on the number of people per country. And that cap obviously targets India because India is the most populated country in the world. Then the second then is China. China is also binding by that cap. But there's more people from India want to come here than Chinese, so India is much more binding. And the wait list for the EB1 right now is about 2 decades for Indians. For the next category, which is people with advanced degrees, the engineers, the people who work at the big tech companies, the CEOs, they are in a 100-year wait list. So they will never get it. They will die waiting. And at the same time, you have a huge flow of people who come here as elderly, legal immigrants. For example, every American can sponsor their foreign-born parents. You have to be 21 to sponsor them. Usually it's people in their late 20s or 30s, or really people in their 40s who came here through other channels legally. And then they sponsor their parents when they naturalize. So it's people in their 60s and even 70s. And you know how many people of those come? About 140,000 of those come every year. It's 14% of the immigration flow. It's more than all the high skilled immigrants combined with their spouses and kids. And so you have this immigration policy that basically maximizes the number of Social Security recipients and minimizes the number of entrepreneurs and highly paid people that come. I think it's just nonsensical. There's also a visa for investors, multimillionaires, the EB5 program. You have to invest at least 1 point something, I think $1.8 million, and create 10 jobs in your business to do so, to obtain it. Only 9,000 multimillionaires are allowed every year in the US because we can't have too many rich people in this country, that would be a terrible thing, too many rich people paying taxes and creating jobs in America.
Well, I can imagine how the argument might go. The allocating access to membership in the American community shouldn't be based purely on a dollar calculation. The parents of citizens are entitled to join their offspring here in the country. We affirm the unity of their family and so on like that. And there's something mercenary about the calibrating of position in the queue. Not everybody can come, so you're rationing, giving priority to people because they have money. That's it's not for sale. It shouldn't be for sale. This is the attitude.
Yeah, I heard that argument. And look, if you think that, then you also have to be willing to pay the price for that opinion. And the United States is paying the price because when you bring in your elderly family member, you're externalizing that cost to the rest of society who didn't get a choice in your decision. You're externalizing it in the form of Medicare and Social Security. And by stopping the multimillionaire investor, you're also externalizing the cost of your choice on the unemployed worker and on the low wage person that could have otherwise get a better paid job. So it's all trade-offs, right?
I did not know that an elderly immigrant coming de novo to the country, having not contributed to Social Security during their working life, was nevertheless entitled to benefits. Is that
Well,
true?
not immediately. Not immediately. They have to wait until for 5 years.
Uh
Um,
huh.
But then you only need to pay for what's called 10 work credits, and the Social Security Administration also gives you credit for if you lived in another country and you paid to other social security system. George Borjas has a paper from the 90s, I think, on how immigrants get overpaid social security benefits partly because of this. Immigrants also live much longer than native born Americans, so that contributes. Um, and so, yeah, it contributes to a net cost.
Have you tried to calculate in more concrete terms exactly what difference it makes whether or not a new immigrant to the United States has or doesn't have a college degree, is or is not a professional, and so on? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So basically, the most positive category is somebody who came to the US between the ages of 18 and 24 years old and ends up obtaining a graduate degree. So, master's, PhD, lawyer, doctor, etc. Uh, those people are a net contributor to the federal government of over $1 million, over $1.5 million over their lifetime in net present value. So that is, if we add up all their taxes, if we add up all the value of the things they get from the government, even assuming they increase military spending and everything, the roads, absolutely everything, and we discount those payments to $2024 and 3% discount rate over time, you get over $1.5 million net reduction in the budget deficit from a person like that. If you bring in, say, a high school dropout who arrived in his 50s, you get a net increase in the budget deficit over $300,000. And so the spectrum goes from there. So everybody with a college degree under the age of 55 is a net contributor. For everybody else, is a net deficit, actually. But the average immigrant is a net contributor because the people who are net contributors are so positive that they pull everybody up, all the average.
Have you looked at all at the labor market consequences of immigration? What about effects on the wages of incumbent domestic residents and so on?
Yeah.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, I haven't on this study specifically, but in general, most of the studies about immigration and the wage effects have dealt with low skilled immigrants, right? So, like the refugee inflows from Cuba, George has very strong opinions on that. Other people disagree. I think that regardless of your opinion, if you see the results, they are short run effects. They're not long run effects. So it's for a few years. It's not even for a decade, and they're small. It's a few percentage points at most for the targeted group in their skill level. And so imagine you had a huge influx of more high skilled immigrants, right? Instead of low skilled, we get high skilled. Who's going to be negatively affected? The physician is not going to compete with the cook in the restaurant, right? So the restaurant wages and the low skilled wages are going to be unaffected. If anything, there is more demand for their services. They're actually going to go up their wages. And really, that's going to have the secondary effects, right? And in the high school sector, you could say, well, we're going to get lower wages for college professors and as if that wasn't already the case, right? Like most college professors are foreign anyway, and doctors and all of that. Well, this is why actually high skilled immigration reduces income inequality, because it benefits the low paid Americans. And you could say, well, it harms the high paid Americans. That's a bad thing. Not necessarily, because some of these immigrants are innovators, much more likely than low skilled. And so they increase productivity. And so perhaps the effect of the high skilled may be a wash, really. And so that's why I'm so passionate about the high skilled immigration side, because the downsides are so much tinier and the upsides are so much larger. On the low skilled end, you're not going to get the next, big innovation from a construction worker. A construction worker might be good. An agricultural worker might be a good thing, especially on a seasonal thing, right? But you're not going to get a new rocket from it.
So, what's your dissertation? It's on some piece of this large set of issues, I suppose.
Yes, it's about this, and it's about some other issue. I don't know if you've heard of the temporary protected status program,
I
which
don't.
is, yeah,
Isn't that the one which has authorized the Haitians in Springfield, Ohio?
yes. Though they also came here under parole, by the Biden administration. Um, but TPS basically legalizes anybody who had been in the US until that point that it was declared. And so it's a really big shock to see what happens. That's what my paper looks at. What happens when an illegal immigrant gets legal status? What happens to their labor market prospects? You would say,
Ah,
well, obviously they're better off, right? That's not an innovation from the research standpoint. Everybody knows they're better off. But my research look at who is better off. Turns out that it's the highly educated illegal immigrants who benefit from legal status more than anyone. Because if you are a nurse, right, or any other occupation that say needs a license, or is some, more educated, that Apple is not going to hire you if you are illegal in the United States. They only hire legal workers, right? Um, only a construction company or a restaurant will hire you illegally. So those highly skilled illegal immigrants are able to move out of low skilled occupations when they get legal status. And their wages go up tremendously, while the other illegal immigrants don't benefit very much from legalization. So all these congressional debates about let's legalize the farm workers. Yeah, maybe you want to legalize the farm workers, but there's still going to be farm workers after you legalize them. But if you legalize the college educated illegal immigrants, like say the Dreamers, when Obama did the Dreamers executive action, those people all had to go to college. Those people actually were able to become lawyers and doctors and do professions that were much more highly paid. In fact, this is an argument in favor of the whole Dreamer legalization and concepts like that.
I see. So you're looking not just at selective admissions of highly skilled people, but also at differential treatment of those who are highly skilled already here who may not have legal status.
Yes.
Uh, that's interesting. So if you were writing the platform, the program, the Project 2025 chapter on immigration, what would it be? What would a conservative administration that was uh, enjoyed the support of Congress and basically challenged to formulate a policy? What would that look like?
Mm. Well, if I had the power of say just 51 votes in the Senate, not 60, because if it was 60, I could do a lot more, right? But imagine it was just 51. I would do what I mentioned about securing the border with funding detention centers across the border to detain everybody who comes illegally. I would hire over 1,000 new immigration judges. I would have much more stringent, credible fear vetting so that even before you're allowed to get to a judge, your claim is vetted. Um,
Meaning some of those could be rejected.
yes, most, perhaps. Um, I don't know what's going to happen, but most, perhaps. Um, that's something Biden has tried to do, but they just don't have the staff to do it to everyone. So most people don't even get interviewed for credible fear screening because they don't have the number of employees to even interview them.
So they're not entitled to a hearing before a judge. They could be screened and
It could be
sorted out.
screened. That's right.
Okay, go on, go on.
So
You would
so
hire.
so
Yeah.
so that's what I would do, and that's why I would secure the border. I would obviously put pressure on other countries to take their deported citizens. This happened in the early 2000s with the Bush administration. Haiti didn't want to take people. It was a big problem, and the Bush administration sent the Coast Guard with some Haitians without authorization, went to the coast of Haiti and dropped them off. Maybe we need to get tough like that, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I think needs to be done, especially with the criminals, right? Because I'm talking about gang members from Chandiagua, the new Venezuelan gang, right, that is terrorizing other migrants in the country. That's the kind of thing that needs to be done. So the criminals, there will be no sanctuary cities. Their funding would be pulled out. That's a big problem today. because it's not a sanctuary for immigrants who are here just working and not committing crimes. It's a sanctuary in that the police, the local police, is forbidden from calling ICE if they arrest a criminal who is here as a non-citizen. And so the killer of Lake and Riley, the young lady who died in Georgia, for example, turns out that man, Jose Barra, had been arrested in New York City earlier, before going to Georgia. He was a shoplifter, I believe. NYPD, because in New York City it's a sanctuary city, did not call ICE on Jose Barra. And that's why Jose Barra was able to flee. In addition to the no calling ICE, it's also no bail. So he was also released as any American would be released without bail. And he went to Georgia and then he killed this girl. That was totally preventable. Not only because he shouldn't have been in the US, which, well, maybe you say, well, but he claimed asylum and he had a credible fear. Okay, he had a credible fear. But he wouldn't even have been able to go to Georgia because he would have been deported as soon as he committed his first crime. Because you don't want shoplifters in the United States either, not just killers. You don't want drunk drivers. You don't want there's so many people who want to come to the US that are hard workers that perhaps should be able to come, really. I think there's a lot of people that are not allowed to come that should be allowed to. And that's the case for any country. But criminals, so that's the kind of thing that I would reform. And then on the legal immigration side, I would do similar to the recommendations I made in my report for the Manhattan Institute. I would exempt anybody with a graduate degree from CAP, so they would be allowed to come if they qualify with the current procedures. I would probably institute some sort of wage test so that if you earn over a certain amount of money, you're just allowed to get a green card. And then just the investment portion, and probably restrict the ability of Americans to bring in their parents unless they pay an amount to the government to compensate for the cost. Or as Tom Cotton had proposed, they can come but not obtain a green card. They can work and live here but not get a green card and get Social Security and Medicare. So I think that that's a good compromise. I think it would be extremely beneficial for the US. I would actually do a legalization program for the people already here. I think it's unsustainable to have people here illegally. I think many of them, it's actually really unfair because in 1996, before 1996, if you had come to the US illegally and you married an American, or you had a child in the US and the child turned 21, so you have been here for at least 21 years, you were allowed to fix your status and become legal. After 1996, you were not allowed anymore. And so today we have over 1 million Americans married to illegal immigrants that cannot fix their status. I think that's a tragedy.
I mean, if you acknowledge that you're not going to deport somebody, it seems to me there's a compelling case to normalize their status given that they're here. The only case I can see against doing that is the forward-looking case that it creates a precedent which will influence the behavior of other people because you have a Samaritan's dilemma. You can't commit to actually doing anything about them. But I don't know. What do you think about that? I mean, do you have any idea how many people are living without legal authorization in the United States right now? I mean, 10 million,
Well,
12 million, 15 million? How many?
I think it's probably over 15 million at this point, given the current border crisis, because pre-Biden administration, it was thought to be about 11 million. And we know just from the CBO that it's been over 5 million coming. But, there's also deportations and people go back voluntarily. And so I would say about 15 million is a reasonable estimate, but perhaps it's more. That's what I would say. The difference is that before, people tried to avoid being caught at the border and they came illegally without being caught. Now they actually want to be caught. They line up to turn themselves in because they know they will get a court date. So the rate of evasion, the gotaways, those people, no, all the criminals, they were actually caught. They weren't like sneaking in, almost any of them. They actually passed through Border Patrol. They were still let in, even though they had tattoos and were parts of a gang, which shows how little vetting is being done, right? Like maybe it's just that they're overwhelmed, you could say, but it's certainly a problem. So on the forward-looking case, I think that's always been the debate, right? If you legalize people, then more people are going to come because they will be legalized again. But if my proposal is implemented, everybody who can come, but they will be detained and they won't be released unless they're approved, right? And so as long as you have detention, there is no incentive to come, but you need to be willing to detain. And, I think that's totally fair. Australia does it, by the way. Not only do they detain people, they send them to an island in the Indic Ocean before they make the decision.
Now, you said if you had 60 votes, which means you can get past the filibuster, it would be a different story. Can you get any of this? Universal detention, or on the legal immigration side, automatic no ceilings on people coming from countries if they have college degrees or something like that. Can
Yeah.
you get that through a Senate without the 60?
The legal immigration side, no, but you can definitely get a coalition of people. The president supported it to get on the high school side to 60 votes. And you can at least get all the Democrats and half of the Republicans really on that if you also do the part of the detention. But the detention doesn't need 60 votes because it's just money. So you can do it through the budget process. And for that, you just need the 50 plus one, right? And so I would do the detention first. And that would I hope that would build the credibility with the Republicans to say, hey, we can negotiate something with the Democrats. Let's reduce the low-skilled legal immigration in exchange for more high-skilled legal immigration. For example, the diversity visa lottery, the U.S. literally gives out 55,000 green cards randomly to people from not all countries, only countries that are small every year, that I estimate could raise enormous sums of money for the government. It would also be much fairer, really, if those were instead given to highly skilled immigrants, right? Who have a job offer, who are highly paid, who have a higher education, who know English. That's a huge
Yeah,
part, right? I think the
yeah,
English part is important. I think the US should be more tougher about requiring that people learn English. Other countries require, Germany requires people learn German. Australia requires that people learn English. I think it's actually a good thing for the immigrants because people will make the effort to learn English and that will be a good thing for them. And it will be a good thing for society, right? So much of the tensions, for example, what's happening in Springfield, so much of those tensions of cultural differences, do you think this would have been a national scandal if it had been 20,000 Indian, highly skilled immigrants instead of 20,000 Haitians? It wouldn't have happened because they spoke English, because they didn't receive any government benefits. And it's not like it's a very similar culture, okay? It's a very different culture, the Indian culture. Am I wrong?
no, you're right. You're right about that. I'm just trying to think about whose job would be getting competed against if it was highly skilled. It would be a different set of people
But by the
altogether.
way, it already happened. Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
northern New Jersey. Do you see the highly skilled Americans in mass protest? Because the college professors protesting, the native born college professors against their foreign born colleagues, they like it.
Let me ask you this. Is there any evidence that President Trump has said they're dumping their jails and their mental institutions and what? Is there any evidence from Venezuela, your Venezuela, that the government is encouraging the migration of criminals, gang members, mentally ill people to the U.S. border?
Uh, Certainly not mentally ill people. There are no mental institutions in Venezuela. That's that's the problem. People don't go to prison in Venezuela very much. That's why Venezuela is dangerous. And so I never believed the claim that they were being sent because Venezuela was dangerous because people were not in prison in the first place. People who are in prison are there. The prisoners control it. They even have chicken farms inside. They have like even banks inside their own prison. They run the cartels from the prison. There are no government officials inside allowed. I think the Reason Foundation and then Vice before, when it still existed, they had done something inside Venezuelan prisons you can watch that is fascinating. They get inside, and it's a terrible mess. So I don't think they're being sent. I think simply Venezuela ran out of things to steal, so these gangs became international. They went first to Colombia, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and they're making money. And the U.S. was the next target. And then the Venezuelan government has made it worse by not accepting them to be sent back to Venezuela. So in that way, the Venezuelan government does want to keep them there. They don't want to help. They don't want to get them back. And why would they, right? And so I think that that's the way it's happening. I don't think there is this conspiracy by other governments to ship criminals to the United States. I don't think that's happening.
What's the time frame on your finishing the dissertation?
Hopefully this academic year.
Well, sounds good. You'll be on the job market then.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Daniel, I want to thank you for coming on the Glenn Show, sharing some of your wisdom with us, and wish you all the best in your next step professionally. I learned a lot from talking with you tonight.
Well, thank you so much for your questions and your time, Glenn. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.